Templates can be a fantastic way to help speed up your workflow when making music. However, sometimes creating a template can be tedious, confusing, and take a really long time. So in this video, what I want to do is break down what I think makes a good template, some of the things that's worth considering, including if you're thinking about creating your own template, to help take some of the guesswork out of it. And throughout, I'm going to be going through examples of what I have set up in my own template to help maybe give you some ideas and how I've put these techniques and concepts into practice myself. First up, if you're not aware, a template is basically a preset session that has defined tracks, instruments, routings, effects, etc. already set up ready for you to use. Different DAWs have different ways of working with and setting up templates, but if you're using Ableton Live, the process is really simple. And in fact, I have a whole video that goes through how to set up your own template and how to use templates in a more effective way. But in this video, I want to talk specifically about music making templates and what you should think about including when creating your own. So speaking of, let's get into the things that I think should be included in a good template. But before we do, it's worth noting that of course you can have templates for various different things. You could have templates for making music, you could have templates for making certain types of music, you could have templates for mixing or mastering music, recording music, whatever it is. But in this video, I want to specifically talk about templates for making music, although of course the concepts can basically be applied to any type of template you want to create. Although on a general basis, the things you'll probably want to include in a template when it comes to making music are the things that you use and set up 90% of the time when beginning a new session. Now this could really be anything, but for reasons I'll talk about later, in general, it's good to include things like routings, groups, buses, return tracks, sidechain setups, analyzers, and specific sounds that you always find yourself using. Particularly if you work with recorded instruments such as vocals, guitars, drums, or anything like that, it's generally a good idea to have tracks already set up in your template session with the input and output settings for your audio interface already set up on them. If you're simply recording audio, this could just involve setting up a track, naming it something like vocals, and setting the input correctly to whatever input it generally is on your audio interface. And if you're working with external MIDI equipment, say synthesizers, having some MIDI tracks set up with that MIDI routing already set up is a fantastic way to make sure that you don't have to kind of set that up from scratch every single time. When it comes to routings in my own template, the only thing I've really got set up here is this mic input track on my vocals group. And this is just consistently set up to be recording from the first input on my computer. As I'm currently traveling, this is just the internal built-in microphone of my laptop. And because I'm traveling, I don't have an external audio interface or anything like that. However, when I wasn't traveling and I had a studio set up, I did have tracks set up in this template further on down that were already routed to record inputs from things like my external keyboard and guitar. Now, this idea of routing also carries over to other things in your sessions like groups and buses. For example, setting up your template so that you can always have a group for things like drums, synths, bass, guitars, vocals, effects, etc. is a really good way to keep your sessions consistent and organized. You can also use the same track orders, color coding, and naming conventions to help keep things even more easy and consistent from session to session, and easier to navigate when you go back through old sessions. Now, when it comes to my own template, I do have some groups and stuff already set up here. You'll see I've got this drums group or folder, which has all of my preset drum tracks in here. Inside of this, I have some further group tracks as well. I have this bass track, sub bass, synth, vox or vocals, and effects. And each of these group tracks here, or group folders, are all being sent out to these buses. We have a drums bus, bass bus, which is taking the input from the bass group and the sub bass group, this synth bus, vocals bus, and effects bus. And this just allows me a few different stages through which I can control volume, and it means that later on down the line, I can just start working with these different buses here, as opposed to having to go into the individual groups. And I just find it a little bit of a quicker and easier way to work. It just works with my brain a little bit more. And then all of these different buses here go to this pre-master group, which then sends out to the main track. This can be kind of redundant, but I do find it's nice to have this extra volume control here before sending to my main or master track. Next up is return tracks. Now, having return tracks set up in your template with specific effects that you always use, certain reverbs and delays, or maybe even parallel compression or distortion, for instance, can be a really great way to quickly add these kind of effects in your session to help stay in the creative workflow. It can also help to create a more cohesive sound across all of your tracks. Now, I will admit that I don't actually have any return tracks set up in my own template, but that's because I don't don't typically find myself using them. However, as I'm working a lot more with vocals and I am using return tracks a lot more when it comes to vocals, I may end up setting up some return tracks later on down the line, and that kind of ties into a point that I'll talk about a little bit later. Now, if you're working particularly in electronic music, you may also benefit from having some kind of sidechain routing setup already set up in your session. If you don't know what I mean, I'm specifically talking about sidechain compression. Generally in a lot of electronic music, things are often sidechain compressed to the kick drum and or the snare to create a lot more room and space in the mix, and also sometimes to create more of a pumping effect when these different elements play. Now, the setup for this will vary quite significantly depending on how you like to do your sidechaining. However, I do recommend having a sidechain trigger set up so that you can use that track to trigger all of your different sidechaining volume shapers or compressors, whatever it is you have set up on all your different tracks in your session. Of course, it's also worth then having the sidechain compressor or volume shaper already set up on the tracks or groups that you want to apply that sidechain movement to. So for instance, here I have this sidechain trigger 1 and sidechain trigger 2 tracks, and these just have a little audio click on them. However, the way that I'm using my sidechain is not actually with audio, it's with MIDI. These two different tracks here are receiving their MIDI from the kick and snare tracks respectively inside of the drum group. And then on my bus tracks down here, the bass, synth, Vox, and effects buses, I am using the Duck Buddy Max for Live plugin with the sidechain routing already set up to receive the input MIDI from those sidechain trigger channels. That way, whenever I put any kind of MIDI on this kick track, particularly, it always ends up just immediately applying some sidechain volume shaping to these different elements here. And then later on down the line, I can go and finesse that, but it's really good having this just set up from the get-go so I can kind of get a gist of what it sounds like and things start to sound a little bit more cohesive right out of the gate. The next thing I recommend having set up is some kind of analyzer setup on your master or main track so that you can visually see and analyze exactly what's going on in your session at any given point in time. These different analyzers could include things like spectrum analyzers, spectrograms, loudness meters, oscilloscopes, phase correlation meters, anything that you often like to use to measure or analyze the output in audio of your session. Now, of course, you could put whatever you like. However, I do at the very least recommend having a spectrum analyzer such as the one that comes with your digital audio workstation, or a free third-party plugin like Voxengo Span, for instance, to help just at least analyze the frequency spectrum overall of your entire track. It's also worth noting that it's good to play around with the settings of these different analyzers so that you can get them set up exactly how you want them, because oftentimes, particularly with things like spectrum analyzers, different settings can show drastically different things. So it's a good idea to have a bit of a handle on exactly what it is you're looking at and what you're trying to achieve by looking at it through that analyzer. For example, here on my main track, I have Ableton Live's spectrum analyzer, which I can open by just double clicking here, set up with the range control starting at 0 to -180. I have some settings here that I like. I then also have Isotope's tonal balance control, Isotope Insight 2, which allows me to monitor the LUFS levels of my track. I have Sub Ninja here, which is an oscilloscope plugin, which I've been really enjoying. And I also have Vision 4X, which is something that I don't use a huge amount, but sometimes I find it really nice to just view the entirety of all these different meters here. We have a spectrum analyzer. Here we have a spectrogram, we have an oscilloscope, and a phase correlation meter. Also, it's common practice and I think a good idea to have some kind of limiter on your main or master track just to stop your output from clipping on your master, because this can sound not fantastic depending on the setup you're working with. Although it is of course worth remembering that you do have a limiter there because it can affect the sound and color it, and you might get some weird pumping if you're pushing that limiter too hard. Lastly, you can also have any specific sounds that you find yourself using all the time preloaded up in your session on certain tracks. However, with this one, I recommend it's a good idea to not overdo it and really lock yourself into a sound palette right out of the get-go, unless that's exactly what you want to do. Instead, I recommend using this technique in a little bit more of a utilitarian way and setting up sounds for things that don't necessarily influence the creative output of your track too much. For example, I only have 3 of these different types of sounds set up in my session. Up here in my sub group, I have a sub bass instrument already set up, which is one that I've designed in Operator, as well as a sub drop that I've already set up too, which is something you can actually go and download for free from my Buy Me a Coffee page. Lastly, I have a grand piano sound set up here in my vocals group, just so that I can pen in a vocal melody so that I can sing along to it, because I'm not a fantastic singer and I'm using my own vocals a lot more in my own tracks now. And having some kind of melodic sound just also helps me to sketch out ideas as soon as I open up the DAW. Now, specifically if you're in Ableton Live, it can also be a nice idea to set up some custom key commands using the key mapping feature in the software. This is particularly useful for setting up keyboard shortcuts for things that don't necessarily already have them. For example, if I open up the key mapping view in my own template with Command or Control and K, we can see that I've got a few different things mapped here. I have the lock envelopes button in the arrangement view mapped to the / key. I have some different device open and plugin on options mapped to different keys here, which are all of the analyzers on my main track. I have the MIDI pre-listen in the clip mapped to the P key, and I have the locator set mapped to the Y key. And what this means is that I can just click kind of anywhere in my session, and I can press the Y button on my keyboard when the computer MIDI keyboard is turned off, to just add a locator there, which I find really useful. As a final thing, let's just run through some of the extra things I have set up in this template. Down the bottom here, I have this extras track, which allows me to drop in a reference track here, as well as contains a resample track that I can just resample my entire session into this track, or whatever I have soloed, so that I can easily drag the audio back into another track and work with it in a creative way. And up the top of my session, I also have a few different tracks. I have this notes track, which I find is a really cool way to add notes to certain parts of the sessions. This is a MIDI track that I can just select a range on, create a MIDI clip, and then maybe rename this MIDI clip to change drums here. And then I know that I need to do something with the drums there. I have this track length track, which allows me to set or create a MIDI clip for the export length of the track that I want. And then I also have another MIDI track, which is this chord progression track, which I'll be honest, I don't use a huge amount, but sometimes I might use this if I'm doing some kind of vocoding setup or something. I might create a MIDI clip here with the chord progression that I'm using in that particular, or in this particular track, just so that I have that as a reference up the top here. Again, I don't use that a huge amount, but it is handy when I do need it. Lastly, you might also find it useful to set up things like a default tempo to begin your session with. I have mine set at 174 because I've been writing a lot of drum and bass recently. And you might also like to have a default scale set up if you're using Ableton Live and you're using scale awareness, or the scale mode, for instance. By the way, if you're looking to further improve your music making journey, I offer a bunch of different things like one-on-one lessons, monthly mentorships, online courses, and music making products, all of which you can find either on my website or Buy Me a Coffee page. There'll be links in the description. So now that we've gone through some good things to include in your template, and I've kind of shown you through my own template a little bit, let's go through some kind of good practice tips for setting up your own template using some of these concepts. The first is to keep it simple. Generally speaking, templates should be used to kind of take away all of the tedious and repetitive tasks that you often do when starting a new session. You generally don't want to have a template that's too bloated, meaning that it has too many tracks that you don't use, too many effects that you won't often use, or too many other things, too many sounds or ways of working that don't really work with you, or that force you into a specific way of working too much. The more tracks and plugins and devices and stuff you have set up in your template, the longer it might also take your template to load up. So that's something worth bearing in mind as well. Now, all of that might sound a little bit contradictory after looking at my own setup here, but I can guarantee you that I use every single one of these tracks and everything that I've set up in my sessions. The second tip is to keep it flexible. As I've mentioned a few times, if you're not careful, a template can lock you into a very specific way of working. Instead, I find it's a good idea to have a template that allows you freedom and flexibility when creating music, so that you don't have to undo things the template's already set up for you. The template should provide just enough structure to speed up and enhance your workflow, but again, not detract from the creative process in any way. Thirdly, templates are individual. Templates are something that should be tailored to you and your specific workflow, no one else. And that's the reason I'm not giving away this template, because I don't think it's useful for other people to have this template. Instead, I think it's useful to see how these concepts are applied so that you can apply them to your own workflow and template setup. Ultimately, particularly when it comes to creative music making templates, the template should be tailored to the way that you work and not the way that anyone else works. And that's okay. One little caveat to this though is that templates can be a good way of helping you to adopt new ways of working or new habits when creating music. For example, if you saw a technique in a YouTube video or something and you think that it might be useful to the way that you work, but you haven't quite consciously adopted it yet, setting up that particular technique in your template can be a good way of helping to test out whether or not it works for you, and also helping you to consciously adopt that particular way of working if it's something you're interested in doing. As I mentioned closer to the beginning of the video, it's also worth remembering that you can have multiple different templates for different purposes. Of course, we don't always make music in exactly the same way or do entirely the exact same things when working in a digital audio workstation. So for this reason, it can be a good idea to have different templates set up for different purposes. For example, we might want to have a template set up for when we're specifically recording with external gear. We might want to have a template set up specifically for mixing or mastering purposes. We might want to have a few different creative templates set up depending on the type of music that we're usually creating or want to create for that particular session. However, it's a good idea to remember across all of these different templates to have some kind of consistency so that you're not having to switch your brain all the time when moving back and forth between these different templates. And finally, templates are ever changing and ever evolving, and you probably won't get it right the first time around. In fact, you probably won't ever get a template right. As you progress in your music making workflows and learn about new techniques, get access to new tools, etc., your template should also change to reflect these new ways of working that you want to use. And in fact, it's okay for your template to change. I actually encourage you to change your template every so often based on how you find yourself working and your workflow changing across different sessions. Also, when you first start setting up your templates, you'll probably find that you haven't done a fantastic job and that your template actually conflicts a lot with the way of working that you want to use or that you are used to using. I know that personally, it took me a very long time and many different iterations of templates to come up with one that I actually enjoyed using and found worked for me to help improve my workflow. So if you don't get it right the first time, don't be discouraged. Instead, just analyze what's gone wrong with it, get rid of some things, maybe make it more simple, think about exactly the way it is that you want to work, maybe write down some notes, and then change a new template to reflect those ways of working and the things that did and didn't go right with your previous template. Templates should be things that grow along with you, your workflow, and your own music making journey, and not things that hold it back. So I hope this video gave you some ideas and helped you out in terms of coming to set up your own template. If you want some workflow tips and tricks for helping use templates more efficiently, check out this video right here. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you all in the next video.